Napoleon 1813, Battle of the Nations. In October 1813, the earth trembled under the weight of 500,000 men. At Leipzig, the largest battle in European history was about to decide the fate of a continent. For years, Napoleon Bonaparte had ruled Europe like a colossus, but now everything was about to change. The man who once redrew borders with a glance now watched them closing in around him. His empire was crushing down, his enemies multiplying, and the shadow of defeat was growing longer with every passing day. This is the story of the Battle of the Nations, the clash that shattered an empire and marked the beginning of Napoleon's fall. The shadow over Europe. The year 1813 marked nearly a decade of Napoleon running Europe like it was his own chessboard. The chill winds of autumn swept across the heart of Europe, carrying with them the scent of gunpowder, mud, and the ghosts of empires. Napoleon Bonaparte, who was once the unchallenged master of the continent, now faced the greatest crisis of his reign. 9 years had passed since he had crowned himself Emperor of the French, 9 years since his armies had fought across Europe like an unstoppable storm. But now, times are changing. The long, grueling war in Spain had bled France white. What was meant to be a conquest had turned into a nightmare of guerrilla warfare, ambushes, and attrition. British redcoats, alongside Spanish patriots and Portuguese allies, had defied the eagles of France, and now their victory was complete. The once invincible French legions had been hurled back across the Pyrenees, and an Anglo-Spanish-Portuguese army, under the relentless Duke of Wellington, was marching to invade France itself. Meanwhile, a darker storm was gathering to the east. In Germany, the unthinkable had happened. Bavaria had been one of Napoleon's oldest allies within the Confederation of the Rhine, and they had turned against him, joining the swelling ranks of the Sixth Coalition. One by one, old partners were abandoning the emperor who had once dictated the fate of kings. Now, in the middle of Saxony, Napoleon found himself encircled, hemmed in by 4 massive armies, converging from every direction like wolves closing in on a wounded lion. These were not the same opponents he had crushed in the glory days of Austerlitz and Jena. Those humiliations and those devastating defeats at the hands of the French had burned themselves into the souls of Russia, Prussia, and Austria. They had learned, they had adapted, they had rebuilt their armies, retrained their officers, and reforged their spirit in the fires of defeat. No longer did they march in blind columns into the jaws of Napoleon's artillery. No longer did they underestimate the brilliance of the man who had shattered empires. Now they came for him, united, organized, and patient. And they came in numbers Europe had never before seen on a single field. At this point, the largest of these forces was the Army of Bohemia, a massive coalition under the command of Austrian Field Marshal Karl Philipp, Prince of Schwarzenberg. His army was an empire in motion with nearly 200,000 men drawn from every corner of Central Europe, accompanied by 790 cannon that rumbled like distant thunder as they advanced toward Saxony. Austrians in gleaming white coats, Russian grenadiers hardened by the snows of 1812, and grim-faced Prussian infantrymen who had sworn vengeance for Jena and Auerstedt, all marched beneath the banners of the coalition. To the north, the indomitable Field Marshal Blücher, commanding the army of Silesia, pushed southward with his trademark aggression. Beside him was another figure advanced, a ghost from Napoleon's own past, Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, once one of the emperor's marshals, now the Crown Prince of Sweden, leading the army of the north against his former master. Between them, they commanded 130,000 soldiers and more than 500 guns, a steel wave rolling toward the plains of Leipzig. Farther southeast was General Bennigsen, and his army of Poland tightened their grip around Dresden, bringing another 34,000 men and 135 guns to bear. In all, the coalition fielded over 360,000 troops and 1,500 cannon, with Russia providing the lion's share of men and muscle. It was an alliance of vengeance, born from the ruins of Moscow, the ashes of Vienna, and the humiliation of Berlin. And at the center of it was their single unrelenting goal, to end the reign of Napoleon Bonaparte. Among Bernadotte's northern hosts, a strange new sound was carried across the fields. It was the British rocket artillery, a small experimental troop armed with the fearsome Congreve rockets. They were wildly inaccurate, unreliable, and terrifying. When fired, they screamed across the battlefield like demons unleashed, leaving fiery trails in the sky. Their explosive warheads could devastate formations at close range, though their erratic flight often made them as dangerous to friends as to foe. Still, they represented the future. The first rumors of a new kind of warfare. Facing this colossal storm were Napoleon's army, who were battered, bloodied, but not yet broken. Many of his soldiers had perished in the snows of Russia or the hills of Spain, but those who remained were the hardened steel of the Grande Armée, men who had marched from Cairo to Moscow under the shadow of the imperial eagles. Among them were the ghosts of past glory: Murat, the flamboyant king of Naples, his cavalry still the pride of Europe, Ney, the bravest of the brave, whose courage defied imagination, and the young recruits involving boys barely old enough to lead. These boys were hastily trained to fill the gaps left by fallen heroes. They were raw, untested, but their eyes burned with the same fierce loyalty to the man they called l'Empereur. Napoleon knew the odds. He knew he was outnumbered nearly 2-1, but he also knew that in the chaos of war, numbers alone did not decide fate. For years, he had defied impossible odds and carved victory from despair. Now, surrounded by the greatest armies Europe had ever assembled, he prepared to do it once more. At this point, the fate of an empire and perhaps the destiny of Europe itself would soon be decided on the plains of Saxony. And as the autumn mist rolled in over Leipzig, the Emperor of the French looked out across the horizon and waited for the storm to break. The Emperor's scattered armies. Across the map of Europe, the scattered remnants of Napoleon's once unbreakable Grande Armée stood isolated and besieged with ghosts of their former strength. Some 140,000 French soldiers, loyal to the end, were trapped in fortresses and cities now cut off behind enemy lines. These were not small detachments, but whole corps, veterans of Austerlitz, Wagram and Moscow, and they could do nothing to help their emperor now. In Danzig, General Rapp's 10th Corps clung stubbornly to the city walls, surrounded by Prussian guns and Russian infantry. In Dresden, Marshal Saint-Cyers's 1st Corps was locked in a hopeless siege. Far to the north in Hamburg was Marshal Davout, also known as the Iron Marshal. He held out grimly with his 13th Corps, defying repeated calls to surrender. He swore to defend his post to the last cartridge. Dozens of smaller garrisons dotted the map from the Oder to the Vistula, lonely islands of resistance, holding out in vain against an advancing sea. These men were brave, disciplined and loyal, but to Napoleon, they were beyond reach. Every musket and cannon locked in those fortresses was one less he could bring to Leipzig. Every soldier trapped behind enemy lines was a ghost already counted among his missing. The Emperor's sword arm was strong, but his fingers were slipping from the hilt. Napoleon himself stood about 20 miles north of Leipzig as his main army encamped along the rolling Saxon countryside. To the south, Marshal Joachim Murat, flamboyant King of Naples, commanded 90,000 men, watching the approach of Schwarzenberg's army of Bohemia. At this point, the Emperor studied his maps under the grey October sky. The situation was desperate, but not yet hopeless. If he could move quickly, he might still seize victory from chaos. His plan was daring. Typical of Napoleon's lightning instinct, he would march south at once to join Murat, unite their forces and crush Schwarzenberg before Blücher and Bernadotte could arrive from the north. One hit might shatter the Allied plan before it truly began, so he gave the order, and it was a maneuver worthy of the master. But as so often in war, plans written on parchment rarely survived the first gunshot. Near the small Saxon village of Liebert-Volkwitz, Murat found himself drawn into battle sooner than expected. The coalition's vanguard, advancing faster than reports had warned, collided with his cavalry screen, and what began as a skirmish turned into one of the greatest cavalry battles in European history. The plains trembled beneath the thunder of hooves. 12,000 horsemen clashed across open fields, sabres flashing in the pale light, banners whipping in the wind. French cuirassiers in gleaming steel breastplates charged headlong into ranks of Prussian dragoons and Austrian hussars. Meanwhile, Murat rode at the center of the melee as his plumed helmet caught the sun like a flare. He was everywhere at once, shouting orders, rallying his men, leading charges as if possessed by the spirit of battle itself. At one desperate moment, he found himself surrounded, cut off, a ring of Prussian cavalry closing in. The King of Naples barely escaped with his life while his horse shot beneath him and his uniform slashed to ribbons. Even so, he refused to withdraw until the last bugle call sounded. When the dust settled, the field was littered with bodies and broken horses. Both sides had lost around 2,000 men, though the Allies held the ground. It was a minor victory for the coalition, but it sounded a warning to Napoleon. The enemy was closing faster than he had imagined. By the morning of October 16th, Napoleon had gathered the full weight of his army south of Leipzig. The French camps stretched for miles, smoke from hundreds of cook fires mingling with the mist rising from the Pless River. Officers barked orders, horses neighed, drums rolled through the fog. For many soldiers, this would be their last dawn. Across the river, the coalition prepared for battle. Field Marshal Schwarzenberg, cautious yet bound by the will of monarchs, took command of the Allied forces. Against the advice of his Russian generals, he deployed his troops on both sides of the Pless, a risky move that would cripple his coordination throughout the day. The river, narrow but treacherous, would become a barrier between his own wings. Napoleon saw the flaw immediately. If he could strike hard and fast, he might tear through Schwarzenberg's divided line before Blücher or Bernadotte arrived to seal the trap. He entrusted the northern sector to Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave, ordering him to keep watch for the armies of Blücher and Bernadotte. But Napoleon believed those forces were still a day's march away, and so, impatient to strike, he recalled most of Ney's troops south to join his main attack. Unfortunately, this was a fateful miscalculation. Meanwhile, Schwarzenberg already knew what Napoleon did not, that the Prussians and Swedes were far closer than the Emperor suspected, and that Bennigsen's army of Poland was also advancing from Dresden. The jaws of the trap were closing. Schwarzenberg might have held the title of commander-in-chief, but above him were 3 emperors and kings, each with their own pride, their own ambitions. The Emperor of Austria, the Tsar of Russia, and the King of Prussia all sat within Schwarzenberg's headquarters, each demanding to be heard, each interfering in strategy. Every decision was slowed by argument and every movement delayed by protocol. Schwarzenberg had to balance egos as carefully as he balanced armies. While Napoleon could change a campaign with a single word, the coalition required councils, signatures, and compromise. Yet somehow, amid this chaos, a plan emerged. General Wittgenstein's corps group would spearhead the attack, advancing in 4 main columns, supported by 2 Austrian flanking forces west of the Pless. The goal was to break through the French positions south of Leipzig and drive directly on the city. It was a massive, unwieldy operation, but one that would soon unleash hell across the Saxon plains. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the stillness was destroyed. A bombardment began along the entire front, with hundreds of cannon spitting fire and smoke into the fog. The ground quaked beneath the roar. Russian, Austrian, and Prussian regiments advanced through cold, muddy fields, their uniforms soaked, bayonets glinting in the dim light. The village of Wachau, held by French infantry, was the first to feel the storm. Russian troops surged forward, storming the houses and gardens in brutal hand-to-hand fighting. For a moment, the tricolour flag disappeared beneath a sea of Russian green. But then, from the haze, French artillery opened up with great iron guns, barking at point-blank range, tearing bloody gaps in the ranks. Still, they came on, relentlessly, shouting, "Hurrah!" as they advanced. Napoleon watched from a low hill, impassive. At his command, General Victor's Second Corps counterattacked. French drums beat the charge, and blue-coated infantry surged forward through the smoke. Bayonets flashed. The fighting turned savage and intimate, with men grappling, choking, stabbing in the narrow lanes of Wachau. When it was over, the French tricolour flew once again above the shattered village, but the victory was not complete. The Russians regrouped and came again and again. By midday, Wachau had changed hands 3 times, each assault more ferocious than the last. And this was just the beginning. The Battle of Nations had begun, and Europe itself would tremble before it was done. The fires of Saxony. The sun rose over Saxony on October 16, 1813, through a haze of smoke and gunpowder. The roar of cannon had not stopped since dawn, and the fields south of Leipzig were fast becoming a furnace of blood and iron. These small Saxon villages, including Wachau, Liebertwolkwitz, Markkleeberg, and Dölitz, were brought into the history books. Every crossroads, every churchyard, every orchard became a fortress. Every farmstead was bought and sold again in musket smoke and death. At Markkleeberg, along the coalition's left wing, Prussian General Kleist led his Second Corps against the Polish troops of General Dąbrowski. Men who fought not only for France but for the dream of a reborn Poland. The battle descended into chaos. The Prussians surged across the fields, drums beating as they advanced into withering musket fire. The Polish defenders fired from behind walls and hedgerows, their tricolour banners fluttering defiantly. The air was thick with musket smoke, the stench of powder and sweat. Hour after hour, the struggle raged from street to street. When at last the Prussians forced their way through the barricades, the defenders counterattacked with bayonets and sabres, driving them back. Bodies lay stacked in doorways and along the stream banks, but neither side yielded until the Poles, bleeding and exhausted, were finally pushed out. Markkleeberg had fallen, but at a terrible cost. The fields were littered with the dead and dying, the cries of the wounded mingling with the thunder of cannon still echoing nearby. To the west, on the left bank of the Pless River, the Austrian Second Corps under General Merveldt pressed forward across swampy, broken ground. Their target, the villages of Konowitz and Dölitz, which guarded the French southern flank. The terrain was a nightmare with marshes that swallowed boots and cannon wheels, streams turned red with blood. French musket fire rained down from stone farmhouses, and every fence or ditch became a death trap. The Austrians attacked again and again, their ranks cut apart by artillery hidden among the willows. Their assault on Konowitz faltered amid chaos and confusion, but at Dölitz, after savage fighting, they managed to gain a toehold with a few ruined streets bought with hundreds of lives. It was progress, but paid for in agony. The Austrian line officers could see their emperor's banner fluttering in the distance, but the river and the smoke made it unreachable. On the eastern flank, around 10 a.m., the battle surged once more. General Klenau's 4th Austrian Corps advanced upon the Kolmberg, a ridge dominating the fields near Liebertwolkwitz. The high ground offered the perfect platform for artillery. Whoever held it could rain fire on the enemy below. The Austrians stormed the hill under heavy French fire, their cannon roaring as they established their line. Smoke obscured the landscape, and from the ridge they could see Napoleon's observation post, a small rise known as Gallows Hill, where the emperor himself watched the unfolding battle, silent and motionless, his telescope fixed on the Austrian advance. Napoleon's face was unreadable. Then, with a single order, he unleashed his reply. He called up Augereau's 9th Corps and the Young Guard, his elite reserves, the very image of France's martial pride. To the left, Marshal MacDonald's 11th Corps was moving into position, their blue-coated columns appearing through the morning haze. At his signal, the French counterattack began. MacDonald's troops surged forward like a steel wave. They retook the Kolmberg in a furious uphill assault, driving the Austrians back from the crest. Liebertwolkwitz, too, fell beneath the weight of the counterstroke, French bayonets flashing in the sunlight as they chased their foes across the fields beyond. But as the French advanced, a murmur rippled through their ranks. By late morning, the coalition's offensive had stalled. Every inch they had gained had been torn back by Napoleon's counterattacks. The fields south of Leipzig were soaked with blood, yet the line had hardly moved. But on one crucial flank, far to the west, fortune turned against the French. General Gyulai's Austrian Third Corps, following orders to threaten Napoleon's rear, advanced toward Lindenau, the gateway to the road leading west, Napoleon's only clear route of retreat toward France. The ground was swampy, crisscrossed by dikes and streams, but the Austrians pushed on with their artillery thundering. Napoleon could not risk losing that road. If Lindenau fell, his entire army could be trapped at Leipzig. He quickly ordered Marshal Ney to divert Bertrand's 4th Corps northward to hold the village at all costs. But this decision came at a price. Those men were meant to join Napoleon's main assault on Schwarzenberg, but now they were pinned at Lindenau, fighting to hold open the Emperor's escape route. Every reserve he committed there was one less to tip the balance in the south. And then the real disaster arrived. Reports started coming from Ney's headquarters. Blucher's army of Silesia, who was thought to be a day's march away, was already upon them. The old Prussian warhorse had heard the guns to the south and spurred his men forward through the night. Now, Marmont's 6th Corps, guarding the northern sector, had been forced to turn around to meet this unexpected threat. The clash came at Möcken, a small village northwest of Leipzig. There, French Marines, including the Emperor's elite, defended every house, every garden wall against an entire Prussian corps. The air was filled with the sound of crashing volleys and the screams of the wounded. Dombrowski's Poles, still reeling from their earlier fight at Markkleeberg, held Wiederitzsch against a Russian assault. It turned out that Napoleon had been wrong. Blücher was not a day away, he was here and already attacking. The Emperor's face darkened as the reports came in. His plan for a crushing southern offensive was unraveling before it began. Meanwhile, Blücher had no intention of waiting for orders or coordination. He wanted blood. If he could draw Napoleon's attention north, force him to commit troops away from Schwarzenberg, the rest of the coalition would gain time to recover and reorganize. At this point, the fighting at Möckern was savage. Prussian and Russian regiments charged again and again into the French defenses, their dead piling up before the barricades. But slowly the weight of numbers began to tell. The French were being ground down with their strength bled away, man by man, hour by hour. And in that chaos, Blücher achieved exactly what he had hoped. He diverted the Emperor's attention and relieved the pressure on Schwarzenberg's exhausted troops to the south. In a single day, the old Prussians' fury might have saved the coalition from total defeat. By early afternoon, the Emperor's position was desperate but not yet lost. Across the entire battlefield, he was outnumbered, but in the south against Schwarzenberg's army, he still held a fleeting numerical advantage. It was smaller than he had planned and shrinking with every hour, but it was something. Schwarzenberg and Tsar Alexander were hurriedly bringing up their reserves, yet in their haste many of them found themselves trapped on the wrong side of the Pless River, unable to reach the fighting. Precious hours slipped away as the Allies struggled through the marshes and bridges. Napoleon saw his chance. It was now or never, and at 2 p.m. the order was given. A line of 180 French guns opened fire in unison with a grand battery that shook the ground like thunder. The sky turned black with smoke as shells screamed across the fields, smashing into Austrian and Russian positions. The Allied front buckled under the onslaught. Then the French infantry advanced with Victor's 2nd Corps, Lauriston's 5th Corps, and the Young Guard, their drums rolling like the heartbeat of the army. Behind them, Murat assembled his cavalry of 10,000 horsemen, 2 entire corps, and the greatest cavalry host France had fielded since the days of Austerlitz. Murat raised his sword and fought for the Emperor. They smashed into the coalition line like a living avalanche. The 1st Heavy Cavalry Division broke through to the enemy's grand battery, cutting down gunners at their posts. For a brief, dazzling moment, it seemed as if the road to victory lay open as French sabres glittered within sight of the 3 monarchs themselves, Alexander of Russia, Frederick William of Prussia, and Francis of Austria. But victory soon turned to chaos. The ground, churned by rain and riddled with ditches, broke the charge apart. Horses stumbled and squadrons scattered as momentum faltered, and from the south came the thunder of Austrian cuirassiers and Russian Guard cavalry, charging to meet them. The clash that followed was cataclysmic, with thousands of riders colliding in a storm of steel. As dusk began to fall, the fate of empires hung in the balance. The trumpet of cavalry. The thunder of hooves rose once more across the plains south of Leipzig. Fresh Allied cavalry with squadrons of Austrian cuirassiers and Russian Guard horsemen charged headlong into the exhausted French lines. The ground shook beneath the onrush, French trumpets blared, drums rolled, and for a heartbeat the world seemed nothing but sound and fury. When they met, the impact was like thunder striking steel. Sabres flashed, horses reared, and men screamed as the 2 walls of cavalry collided in a whirl of dust and death. Riders were torn from their saddles, trampled beneath hooves, or dragged into the chaos by broken reins. The air stank of sweat, blood, and gunpowder. For a time, neither side yielded. The French horsemen, veterans of Austerlitz and Wagram, fought with the desperation of men who knew there would be no second chance. Yet wave after wave of Allied squadrons kept coming. Fresh regiments from Austria, Prussia, and Russia got into the picture. Slowly, the French line began to buckle. Trumpet calls signaled retreat, swallowed by the roar of the melee. By mid-afternoon, the battered French cavalry had been driven back to their starting line with their charge spent and their advantage gone. Meanwhile, to the east, another storm was raging. Maison's division of the 5th Corps fought for the shattered village of Guldengosse, a handful of streets now transformed into a nightmare of close combat. Houses burned, walls crumbled beneath cannon fire, smoke turned the afternoon sun into a pale orange disk above the chaos. The French attacked, were thrown back, then counterattacked again. Each side gained and lost the same ground a dozen times. The narrow streets filled with bodies and French grenadiers and Russian guardsmen locked together in death, their uniforms soaked and indistinguishable in the mud. The wounded crawled into doorways, praying for mercy that would never come. As the hours dragged on, Russian and Prussian guard regiments arrived to reinforce the defenders. Their drums were heard across the fields like a death knell. Mason's men, bleeding and exhausted, fought to the last cartridge before Napoleon ordered them to fall back. Gulden Gosse, or what was left of it, was completely lost. The French line contracted once again. The Emperor's grand assault in the south was beginning to falter. At 4 p.m., as the sky darkened beneath drifting smoke, the Austrian Reserve Corps finally reached the battlefield. With renewed vigor, they advanced on Markkleeberg with one of the morning's blood-soaked objectives. The Poles and French defenders fought like men possessed, firing from ruined cottages and behind stone walls. But the Austrians, advancing shoulder to shoulder through the carnage, would not be denied. After hours of savage combat, the white banners of Austria were seen fluttering once again over the village. Markkleeberg was secured, and the Allies had reclaimed the ground that had cost them so dearly in the dawn. By 5 p.m., Napoleon stood upon Gallows Hill, his telescope scanning the smoke-choked horizon. He could see that his forces were spent, and his reserves were gone with his divisions shattered. The south, where he had hoped to deliver a decisive blow, was collapsing into exhaustion. Reports flooded in from every direction, ammunition low, units scattered, casualties staggering. To the north, they were still fighting around Möckern, where French Marines held out against Prussian onslaughts with the last of their ammunition. But even their courage was being tested beyond its limits. In the north, Marshal Marmont's corps clung desperately to Möckern. The Marines fought with impossible bravery, their artillery firing at near point-blank range. Every street corner was a fortress, every farmhouse a last stand. Prussian General York's corps came again and again with lines of blue coats advancing through clouds of smoke, only to be hurled back by grape shot and musket fire. But York was relentless. For every regiment shattered, another took its place. Marmont, struck by shrapnel not once but twice, refused to leave the field. He had his wounds bound and remained in the saddle, shouting orders through the din of battle. His men fought on, inspired by his courage, until the moment the Prussian hussars charged. At this point, the exhausted French Marines could no longer hold. Panic got through the line, and within moments, Möckern fell. Marmont's corps broke and streamed back toward Leipzig in disorder, and the northern sector was lost. As dusk settled around 6 p.m., the guns at last fell silent. The battlefield stretched for miles, a wasteland of fire and corpses. The air was heavy with smoke and the moans of the wounded. The first day of the Battle of the Nations had ended as a day of fury unlike any Europe had ever seen. Napoleon's army had suffered 25,000 casualties, the Allies at least 30,000. He'd come close to victory, but the chance for a decisive hit had slipped through his fingers like sand. The Emperor stood silently in the twilight, his silhouette outlined by the burning villages around Leipzig. He knew that time, once his greatest ally, was now turning against him. Eventually, morning dawned grey and bitter. The fields were still littered with the wreckage of war, shattered cannon, broken sabres, the fallen of 100 nations. For both armies, Sunday, October 17th, brought a fragile, uneasy feeling. The men were too exhausted to fight. The guns were silent, save for the occasional crack of a sniper's musket. Napoleon's soldiers lay where they had fought, sleeping in the mud, clutching empty cartridge boxes. Even the Emperor looked weary as his uniform was stained with dust and smoke, his face drawn and pale. He knew his army needed rest, but more than that, it needed ammunition, food and time, none of which he had in abundance. From the Polish General Poniatowski, the Emperor received a grim report that the 8th Corps had lost a third of its men and many officers. All ammunition stocks have been used up, and a delay in resupply will destroy them, as they cannot maintain combat for even 1 hour. The Emperor read the note in silence, then folded it neatly and placed it in his coat. But there was no reply he could give. That afternoon, Napoleon took a desperate step. He sent a message to his father-in-law, Emperor Francis I of Austria, proposing an armistice. He even offered concessions with something unthinkable for the man who once dictated terms to Europe. But the Allies were no longer interested in peace. They knew now that they had him trapped, surrounded, cut off, and bleeding. Every passing hour brought them new reinforcements. Time itself had become their greatest weapon. While the southern front rested, the north refused to sleep. Blücher, the indomitable Prussian, continued his assault with renewed ferocity. Russian infantry stormed through the villages of Utrecht and Gohlis, their bayonets flashing through the mist. Further west, Russian hussars fell upon Arrighi's 3rd Cavalry Corps, routing part of it in a whirlwind of sabres and smoke. Napoleon could hear the rumble of guns from the north, another reminder that the storm was tightening around him. That day, 14,000 reinforcements arrived for the French, with Regnier's 7th Corps, made up largely of Saxons, men who still fought under Napoleon's eagle. Their arrival lifted morale briefly, but it was a flicker of light against a growing darkness. For even as they joined the French ranks, the coalition armies swelled with new strength. Over 100,000 fresh troops were arriving with Colloredo's Austrian 1st Corps, Bennigsen's Army of Poland, and Bernadotte's Army of the North. Only Bernadotte, the former Marshal of France turned Swedish Crown Prince, advanced slowly as if uncertain whether to crush his old master or watch him fall under the weight of others. The feeling did not last. Napoleon's army, tired and starving, faced an enemy that only grew stronger by the hour, and on the horizon, the smoke of fresh campfires told him what he already knew. Unfortunately, the Battle of Nations was not over. In fact, it was just getting started. The shadow of defeat. By the dawn of October 18, 1813, the tide of history had turned against Napoleon Bonaparte. He had faced dire odds before in Austerlitz, where he triumphed against 3 emperors, Jena, where he destroyed Prussia in days. But this was different. Now the storm had gathered from every direction, and the man who had once conquered Europe stood surrounded by it. On this day, the emperor would face an army nearly twice his own strength. The balance of fate had tipped. It was no longer a question of victory, but of survival. The Emperor of the French began to plan what he had not planned in nearly a decade: a retreat. When the sun rose that Monday morning, its first light revealed an astonishing sight. Across 40 square miles of open plain, the largest battle Europe had ever seen was about to begin. Nearly 500,000 soldiers from every corner of the continent now faced one another. 2,000 cannon stood ready, their muzzles glinting in the pale October sun. The banners of France, Prussia, Austria, Russia, Sweden, Poland, Italy, the Netherlands, and even Britain rippled in the cold breeze. Each man on that field believed that history itself watched from above. This was not just another campaign, this was the battle of the nations, a struggle to decide the future of Europe. Knowing that his position could not hold indefinitely, Napoleon began to pull back his scattered forces into a tighter, more defensible ring around Leipzig. Every regiment, every gun, every patch of ground was to be used to its fullest. He ordered Marshal Bertrand's 4th Corps to march westward toward the bridge at Lindenau to secure the army's line of retreat, the only road that still led back to France. Into Bertrand's place, he sent 2 divisions of the Young Guard, under Marshal Mortier, men barely out of their youth but already hardened by fire. They took up position in the streets and gardens of Lindenau, swearing they would die before letting the road fall to the enemy. Meanwhile, the Allied commander, Field Marshal Schwarzenberg, prepared to close the trap once and for all. His plan was bold: 6 converging attacks, all aimed at crushing Napoleon's shrinking perimeter and cutting off his escape. At sunrise, the great battle began anew. Around 8 a.m., the first thunder of cannon rolled across the southern front. Austrian infantry, advancing through smoke and fog, stormed the village of Dölitz, forcing the French defenders to fall back. But Napoleon's marshals were not yet beaten. Marshal Oudinot mounted a counterattack at the head of a division of the Young Guard, including men with faces still smooth, but eyes already seasoned by war. Their assault was swift and furious. The Austrians were thrown out of Dölitz, leaving the streets piled with their dead. The reversal shocked Schwarzenberg. He had expected Napoleon's army to be breaking apart, not counterattacking with the fury of a cornered beast. Alarmed, he sent immediate orders to recall Gyulai's 3rd Corps from its flanking position to strengthen the southern line. Further east, General Barclay de Tolly's troops advanced through the villages of Wachau and Liebert-Volkwitz. But where they had once found resistance, now there was only strange silence. The French rear guards had withdrawn, leaving behind nothing but corpses and smouldering ruins. For the first time in days, Berkeley's men advanced unopposed, but it felt less like victory and more like walking through the grave of an army. Berkeley paused his advance, wary of an ambush, and waited for Bennigsen's army of Poland to move up on his right before pressing forward again. Then General Bennigsen's troops had the farthest to march, trudging across torn ground churned to mud by days of rain and cannon fire. But by noon, they reached their objectives, driving back Marshal MacDonald's infantry in bitter fighting. The French line bent but did not break, with MacDonald's men fighting like lions, even as they gave ground inch by inch. When Bennigsen's men finally seized their positions, they halted to wait for the arrival of the Army of the North. But the Northern Army was nowhere to be seen. However, the Army of the North, under Crown Prince Bernadotte of Sweden, moved sluggishly, its columns crawling forward through the mist. Bernadotte had once been a Marshal of France, one of Napoleon's own lieutenants, before trading the tricolour for Sweden's blue and gold. Now, as he marched against his former emperor, doubts gnawed at him. Every cannon shot that blew in the distance reminded him of the man he once served and perhaps still feared. His caution drew bitter criticism from his allies. Some rumoured that he was deliberately holding back, unwilling to face Napoleon's wrath directly. Whatever the reason, his delay left a hole in the Allied line, one Napoleon might yet exploit. But it was not so with Blücher, the old Prussian warhorse. Where Bernadotte hesitated, Blücher attacked. Even with his men exhausted and bloodied from the fighting at Möckern, he hurled Russian infantry against the northern defences of Leipzig itself. The assault was savage and unrelenting, with columns of Russians storming through shot and shell toward the city walls. But Napoleon's defences held firm. French cannons, firing at near point-blank range, tore gaping holes in the advancing ranks. When the smoke cleared, thousands of Russians lay dead and the survivors staggered back, leaving the field strewn with bodies. Still, Blücher would not rest. His attacks, though costly, kept the pressure on, eventually forcing Napoleon to divide his already strained forces. By 2 p.m., the emperor was hard-pressed on all fronts, yet still holding. His gaze now fixed on the village of Probstheide, a small cluster of houses and gardens that stood at the heart of his southern front. If Probstheide fell, the road to Leipzig would be open. If it held, the French could still cling to hope. The village had been turned into a fortress. Barricades of wagons, overturned carts and rubble blocked every street. Windows were filled with musketeers and cannons were placed to sweep every approach with grapeshot. Against this fortress came Kleist's Prussian Second Corps. Their attack was relentless, with wave after wave of infantry advancing through smoke and fire. The French met them with disciplined volleys, mowing down the first lines, then the second. The air was alive with screams and the hiss of musket balls. The fighting soon descended into chaos. Houses burned, walls crumbled, and still the Prussians came on. Some regiments lost half their men in a single hour. 3 French generals fell while organizing the defense, their bodies carried away through the smoke. Napoleon watched grimly as the flames of Probstheide reached for the sky. He knew the village must be held at all costs. He turned to his staff and gave a single order: "Send in Friant and the Guard." General Friant's division of the Old Guard, including armies from Egypt, Austerlitz and Moscow, marched into the inferno. Their bayonets gleamed, their faces set like stone. As they entered the burning village, their comrades cheered them like men cheering heroes walking into legend. The battle for Probstheide would become one of the most brutal struggles of the Napoleonic Wars, a fight that symbolized the last desperate courage of the Grande Armée. The battle continues. By the morning of October 19, 1813, the massive battlefield around Leipzig was shaking once again. The third day's inferno had ended in stalemate, but as dawn broke, the balance had finally tipped beyond repair. To the north, Crown Prince Bernadotte's Army of the North had at last joined the fray in full strength. His long-delayed commitment was now a hammer blow. Across the fields near Schönefeld, the ground quivered as Marshal Marmont rallied what was left of his battered corps. He had gathered 137 guns, positioning them in grim, disciplined lines that belched smoke and fire into the advancing Russians. But Bernadotte was ready. The Swedish prince massed 200 cannon in reply, with a wall of iron and flame that answered Napoleon's artillery with earth-shaking fury. Men disappeared into plumes of smoke, their screams lost beneath the roar of guns. For hours, neither side could move forward because the killing was too great. The once green fields of Saxony were now nothing but a wasteland of corpses, broken wheels and shattered cannon. At around 3 p.m., the next act of tragedy began. Von Bülow's Prussian corps, advancing under cover of Austrian Jaegers and accompanied by a small British rocket detachment, launched a fierce assault on the village of Paunsdorf. The strange whine of Congreve rockets streaked through the smoke, exploding with shrieking trails that terrified everyone. Against this assault, General Reynier's 7th Corps, composed mostly of weary Saxons, could not hold. For the Saxons, the war had become unbearable. Their fields were ruined, their homes burned, their families scattered. They no longer fought for Napoleon's glory, they only longed for peace. Then, in one shocking moment, their loyalty snapped. Around 3,000 Saxon soldiers suddenly turned, abandoning their positions, waving white flags and marching over to the enemy. They were cheered by their former foes as they crossed the lines. The defection ripped a hole in Napoleon's northern line, a wound in both his army and his pride. For years he had ruled Europe through fear and loyalty. Now even that was crumbling. The breach was quickly filled by the Guard cavalry, their plumes black with smoke, their faces hard as iron. They charged to plug the gap, sabres drawn, fighting like men who knew the end was near. But the coalition's advance was now unstoppable, a juggernaut of nations pressing in from every direction. As dusk fell over, the fighting reached its terrible crescendo. Under relentless Russian pressure, Marmont was forced to abandon the ruins of Schönefeld, now burning from end to end. To the west, Prussian troops captured Sellerhausen, tightening the noose still further. In the south, Probstheide was somehow still holding, but only just. Every street was a graveyard, every wall was riddled with shot. The French defenders had been fighting without food, without rest, and almost without ammunition. Their muskets were fouled, their cannons silent, yet still they fought on. By nightfall, both armies had suffered another 25,000 casualties. The fields around Leipzig were now soaked with blood and littered with the wreckage of an empire. Napoleon's army was exhausted, outnumbered, encircled, and down to its last cartridges. At last, as the smoke settled over the dying day, the emperor gave the order he had long dreaded. We retreat. Under cover of darkness and the thick autumn fog, the Grande Armée began its withdrawal into Leipzig itself. The movement was silent at first. Only the crunch of boots, the creak of wagons, and the muffled sobs of men too tired to speak. At 4 a.m., the first columns began crossing the Elster River, retreating westward toward France. There was only one bridge, signifying a single lifeline over the dark, sluggish water. There had been time and material to build more crossings. But in the chaos and confusion of battle, no one had given the orders. It would prove a mistake as deadly as any musket shot. Inside Leipzig, the situation was desperate. There was no clear plan for the city's defense, only a patchwork of half-formed units, Poles, Saxons, Westphalians, and Germans who had fought for Napoleon but now questioned why. Among them were 20,000 wounded, lying in churches, houses, and cellars, most beyond saving. At 10 a.m., Napoleon himself left the city. Behind him, chaos exploded. The narrow medieval streets were jammed with troops, horses, and cannon, all trying to reach the bridge. Wagons overturned, blocking the way. Officers shouted orders no one could hear. Drummers beat retreat signals, bugles blared, and the thunder of coalition guns drew ever closer. Then, at 10:30 a.m., the first shells began to fall. The Allies had launched a full-scale assault from the north, east, and south, smashing into the city's defenses. French rearguard units fought desperately at the gates, holding for as long as they could. But soon the enemy was pouring through the streets, house to house, bayonet to bayonet, amid the screams of civilians and the thunder of collapsing walls. Leipzig was burning. Beneath the Elster Bridge, engineers had moored a barge filled with gunpowder, a precaution that was meant to destroy the crossing once the army had escaped. At 2 p.m., as Russian skirmishers appeared on the far bank, a nervous corporal mistook the moment. Believing the enemy had already crossed, he lit the fuse. The explosion was catastrophic. In a single instant, the bridge that happens to be Napoleon's only escape route had vanished in a column of fire and smoke. The blast trapped 30,000 men and 30 generals on the wrong side of the river. The sound of the explosion was followed by screams, chaos, and the sound of panic spreading like wildfire. Men rushed to the banks, some trying to swim, others throwing themselves into the water in despair. Among those trapped was Prince Józef Poniatowski, the gallant Polish commander Napoleon had made a Marshal of France just 3 days before, the only foreigner ever to receive the title. Wounded in several places, his uniform torn and bloodied, he refused to surrender. Mounted on his horse, he rode straight into the river. His men watched in silence as he disappeared into the mist. Halfway across, his horse stumbled. The steep, muddy bank gave way beneath them. The animal rolled over, pinning him beneath the water. When the whole chaos settled, the Polish prince and his nation's hopes were gone. Marshal MacDonald, too, was trapped on the far side. Refusing to give in, he searched for another way across and found 2 fallen trees, laid like makeshift bridges over the torrent. Balancing on the trunks, he began to cross, but the wind was strong and his cloak was a burden, so he cast it off. He was nearly across when others tried to follow. Their weight shook the trees and he fell into the water. He landed hard, but lived. Clawing his way up the muddy bank, he was fired upon by Russian skirmishers who miraculously missed every shot. French soldiers nearby drove them off and pulled him to safety. Soaked, breathless and shaking, MacDonald later recalled, Marshal Marmont gave him a horse. He wanted dry clothes more, but they were not to be had. The destruction of the bridge turned what had been a defeat into a disaster. Thousands of France's best soldiers who were cut off and surrounded were eventually captured. The field that had begun as Napoleon's stand against Europe had become a graveyard of his empire. The emperor's long road of conquest had ended not with triumph, but with retreat. As he rode west toward France, the cannons still thundered behind him. Europe had united not for peace, but to end Napoleon, and at Leipzig they had done just that. The triumph of the monarch. By the evening of October 19th, the sound of cannon had finally fallen silent. Smoke still hung over Leipzig like a funeral shroud, and the fields beyond the city reeked of gunpowder, blood, and burnt timber. In the center of the ruined city, beneath a grey autumn sky, 3 monarchs met amid the wreckage: Tsar Alexander of Russia, Emperor Francis of Austria, and King Frederick William of Prussia. They gathered in victory, surrounded by aides and soldiers too stunned to cheer. For them, this was vindication. After years of humiliation at Napoleon's hands, the kings of Europe had united and prevailed, but even as they clasped hands and saluted their banners, the scale of what had been lost was staggering. Leipzig had been a slaughterhouse. The numbers would never be known precisely, but in just 4 days, the Allied armies suffered more than 52,000 casualties, including men killed, wounded, or missing. Napoleon's losses were even more grievous. He had lost 47,000 killed and wounded, another 35,000 taken prisoner, and 325 guns retrieved. More men were killed and wounded at Leipzig than in any European battle before the horrors of the First World War. It was the largest and bloodiest battle in history up to that time, with a struggle not just of armies, but of nations, ideals, and the limits of one man's ambition. 2 days later, Sir George Jackson, the British ambassador to Austria, rode across the battlefield with Prince Metternich, Austria's calculating foreign minister. They were not prepared for what they saw. A more revolting and sickening exhibition. Scarcely could they move forward a step without passing over the dead body of some poor fellow, gashed with wounds and clotted with blood. Another, perhaps, without an arm or a leg, here and there a headless trunk or a head only, which caused our horses to stumble or start aside. It made one's blood run cold to glance upon the upturned faces of the dead. They got over this field of glory as quickly as they could. Eventually, the battlefield of Leipzig was no longer a field at all, but a graveyard for tens of thousands and a monument to human pride and folly. For Napoleon, the defeat was catastrophic. He had lost not merely a battle, but he had lost the war for Germany, and with it the fragile scaffolding of his empire. Europe's faith in his invincibility had been shattered. With just 80,000 survivors, Napoleon began a grim fighting retreat toward the French border. The once proud Grande Armée was now a shadow of itself, weary, blood-stained, and haunted by what they had left behind. There was no hope of rescue for the 100,000 men trapped in garrisons across Germany and Poland. Cut off, surrounded, and forgotten, they would fight on in isolation, some holding out for 5 months more before surrendering. At Leipzig, Napoleon had lost not only men and guns, but loyalty. Marshal Joachim Murat, his brother-in-law and the flamboyant King of Naples, rode up to take his leave. Murat swore eternal fidelity, his words as glittering as his uniform. But behind his polished charm lay treachery. Within days he would secretly negotiate with the Allies, scheming to save his throne and abandon the man who had made him a king. This was the last time the two men ever saw each other. 11 days after the disaster at Leipzig, Napoleon's retreat turned into yet another fight for survival. Near the town of Hanau, a new threat appeared with 40,000 Bavarian troops, once his allies, now arrayed against him under General von Wrede. Von Wrede had served under Napoleon in many campaigns, and now he wanted to block the emperor's path home. As Napoleon surveyed the Bavarian lines, he gave a thin, bitter smile and remarked to his staff, "I made him a count, but I could not make him a general." Then, with the calm certainty of old genius, he ordered the Imperial Guard to the front. The Guard advanced like a black tide, drums beating through the smoke. Their attack broke the Bavarian line in a storm of musket fire and cannon shot, forcing von Wrede's army into retreat and clearing the way to France. Even in defeat, Napoleon had shown that he was still a master of war. 3 days later, the shattered remnants of the Grande Armée reached Mainz. Napoleon himself pressed on to Paris, riding ahead of his exhausted troops. He needed to face a new political battle to contain the disaster and rally the nation that was now questioning him more than ever. Behind him, his empire was collapsing piece by piece. On November 4th, the coalition powers formally dissolved the Confederation of the Rhine, the network of German states that had once formed the backbone of Napoleon's dominance in Central Europe. Many of these states, including Bavaria, Saxony, and Württemberg, now turned against him, joining the war as his enemies. In the Illyrian provinces, rebellion and Austrian invasion, aided by the British Navy, ended French rule entirely. In northern Italy, Napoleon's stepson, Viceroy Eugène de Beauharnais, was retreating steadily before von Hiller's Austrian army, his position crumbling by the day. And far to the north in Hamburg, the stoic Marshal Davout held firm with 34,000 men surrounded and besieged, refusing to yield. Even as France's borders shrank, pockets of the empire still fought on with determination as they were outnumbered, cut off but unbroken. By the winter of 1813, Napoleon's empire stood on the brink of ruin. His enemies were closing in from every direction, including Austria from the east, Prussia from the north, Britain from the sea. Europe was now united to crush him. Yet the emperor was not finished. Defeat had stripped him of his empire, but not of his brilliance. In the campaign that would follow, he needed to fight for survival, and there, on his own soil, facing impossible odds, Napoleon Bonaparte would again remind the world why he had once been called the Master of War. The Battle of Leipzig, the great Battle of the Nations, marked the beginning of his downfall, but not the end of his legend. The fall of an emperor. Winter lay heavy across the fields of France. Napoleon's once mighty empire had crumbled. The snows of Russia, the blood-soaked fields of Leipzig, and the treachery of his allies had stripped him of nearly everything. Now, in the early months of 1814, the war was coming home. For the first time since he had seized power, France itself was the battlefield. The Allied armies, with nearly 1 million men strong, were closing in from all sides. In the north came Blücher's army of Silesia, a storm of Prussians and Russians hungry for revenge. In the southeast, Schwarzenberg's vast army of Bohemia pushed through the snowbound valleys, Austrian banners glinting through the fog, and all that stood between them and Paris was Napoleon. But this was not the same man who had marched triumphantly through Europe. The emperor was tired, his empire bled white, yet his mind, his will, and his genius for war burned as fiercely as ever. His enemies believed they were chasing a dying fire. They were wrong. In January 1814, Napoleon scraped together what forces he could. The veterans who had followed him from Austerlitz to Moscow stood shoulder to shoulder with fresh-faced conscripts, boys barely old enough to hold a musket. In all, he could muster barely 70,000 men to face an enemy almost 10 times that number. Every village, every crossroads, every river became a fortress. He moved swiftly across the icy plains of Champagne, reading the enemy's movements like lines in a familiar book. He had no illusions. France was being invaded. But if he could strike fast and divide the Allied armies, he might yet save his throne, perhaps even force peace. Then came one of the most brilliant campaigns of his career, the 6 Days of Glory. In early February, Blücher's Prussians pushed recklessly ahead of the main Allied army, thinking Napoleon was broken. But the Emperor moved with the speed of a hawk. In just 6 days, from the 10th to the 15th of February, he struck 4 times at Champaubert, Montmirail, Château-Thierry and Vauchamp, annihilating destroyed Prussian and Russian corps one after another. Snow fell thick upon the battlefield as French cannon roared and musket smoke rolled across the frozen fields. His young conscripts fought like men possessed, inspired by the mere sight of him, the small figure in the grey greatcoat, calm and unyielding amid the chaos. In those 6 furious days, Napoleon had turned disaster into victory. He had destroyed or routed nearly 17,750 casualties on Blücher's army and stunned Europe once more. For a brief, blinding moment, France believed again. But victory could not last. For every Allied corps Napoleon shattered, 2 more crossed the Rhine behind it. The enemy was learning. They avoided battle when he approached and marched on when he turned away. They were like wolves, circling, waiting for the moment to close in. As February turned to March, the Emperor was forced to fight everywhere at once, north to repel Blücher, south to slow Schwarzenberg, west to guard the road to Paris. His staff barely slept. His soldiers marched through snow and mud until their boots fell apart, and still he fought. At Craonne, the Prussians held the high ground with their guns raining death down on the French. Napoleon rode up through the shell fire, his horse foaming, his face set in stone. Then the French stormed the ridge under a hail of iron, capturing the position at enormous cost. But though he had won the field, the Emperor could see the truth in his men's eyes. The spark was fading. By mid-March, the coalition armies regrouped and pressed forward in overwhelming strength. Napoleon tried one last daring maneuver, marching east to threaten their supply lines, hoping to force them to retreat. But the Allied commanders ignored him. Instead, they struck straight for Paris. The Emperor raced back across the countryside, pushing his weary troops day and night. He reached the capital too late. On the 30th of March 1814, the Allies stormed the city's defences. The young and the old fought side by side, including French regulars, National Guardsmen, even students from the École Polytechnique manned the barricades, but they could not hold. By evening, Paris had fallen. When Napoleon heard the news, he was silent for a long time. Then he simply said, "I must go to Fontainebleau." At Fontainebleau Palace, surrounded by his remaining generals, Napoleon still refused to yield. He paced the marble halls, planning counterattacks, dreaming of rallying new armies from the south. But one by one his marshals came to him, but France was exhausted and the war was lost. On the 6th of April 1814, Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of the French and Master of Europe, abdicated his throne. The man who had once crowned himself in glory now signed his name in silence, sealing the end of an era. He requested to march once more with his soldiers to say farewell. In the courtyard of Fontainebleau, surrounded by the Imperial Guard, he mounted the steps and looked down upon the men who had followed him through a decade of fire and conquest, bidding them farewell for their services. Tears ran down the cheeks of battle-hardened veterans as he kissed the tricolour. Then, without a word, he turned away, climbed into his carriage, and was gone. Napoleon's exile to the island of Elba seemed like the end of his story. He had lost his empire, his armies, his crown. Europe breathed a sigh of relief, believing the storm had passed. But the flame of Napoleon Bonaparte was not so easily extinguished. Even as he sailed into the blue horizon, the Emperor's mind was already turning. Indeed, the world had not seen the last of him. Less than a year later, the eagle would rise again and Europe would tremble once more.